Hey folks, welcome to Israel Explained. This has been one incredibly packed day, all of which is bad news for Netanyahu. We'll run through all the things that happened. Today may be seen as a turning point in the war for several reasons. I'm not sure that the correct ones are getting the coverage right now in the news, but they all matter. So let's start with the supposed headline, which is the resolution for a ceasefire that passed in the UN Security Council. Now, of course, the UN is divided into two chambers, the General Assembly and the Security Council, and up until now, the US has been vetoing anything that comes through the Security Council with a ceasefire. Just a few days ago, it tried to get its own resolution through, which was vetoed by China and Russia, as expected. And over the last few days, it's been working with the Algerians and other countries that have been behind this current resolution and gotten it passed. So let's read the main clause of the resolution before we talk about it. It says, quote, demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire, and also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs, and further demands that the parties comply with their obligations under international law in relation to all persons they detain. End quote. It also called for the continued humanitarian aid flow. Generally speaking, there isn't a huge difference between this resolution and the Israeli official policy. Israel's negotiating over a ceasefire that is not a permanent one, like this one calls for. Israel has called for the unconditional release of hostages, and it also has said that it's fine with continued humanitarian supply and that it's no longer going to limit it. There were some issues Israel had with this resolution. For example, it wanted to link the release of hostages to the ceasefire. It wanted a condemnation of Hamas and a few other factors, but none of those things are particularly important in a practical sense. So the United States decided not to vote for the resolution, but rather to abstain. The reason it didn't vote for it is because it was unhappy with the fact that Hamas was not condemned. But since that's not a material issue, it decided to vote for it. And of course, let's not be naive about this. The United States is also sending a message to Israel, a message that it has lost its support of the United States in this operation, and that it is planning to react to a possible invasion of Rafah quite harshly. The resolution passed with 14 in favor and only the United States abstaining, which allowed the resolution to pass. And there was a lot of clapping in the hall when it passed. It has the full backing of the international community, including, to some extent, the United States, showing that Israel is at this point completely isolated in its opposition to this resolution and to the principles behind it. And even Israel isn't really against the principles behind it. It's just gotten very used to the United States vetoing any resolution calling for a ceasefire. The United States managed to get a change from a permanent ceasefire, which was in the original resolution draft, to a lasting ceasefire, which, while not sounding like a very important difference, is rather important in the sense that lasting means that it's not the end of the war. So Israel could, and it has demanded that, be able to renew the war once the ceasefire is over. And of course, at the end of the day, this is an unenforceable resolution. It doesn't call for any sanctions on Israel. Therefore, it's not really important. It doesn't change anything on the ground. So Matthew Miller, the State Department spokesperson, said the U.S. voted for it because the resolution was, quote, consistent with our long-term position. Most importantly, that there should be a ceasefire and there should be a release of hostages, which is what we understood also to be the government of Israel's position, end quote. So what Miller is saying is this isn't that dissimilar to the Israeli position. Of course, over the last 2 days, Israeli officials and American officials have talked about this. Netanyahu was very upset when the Americans told him that they were not going to veto this resolution, and he threatened pull the delegation out from talks over what kind of operation we will see in Rafah. And that is exactly what he did once it passed. So Netanyahu criticized the resolution, or criticized, I should say, the American decision not to veto it, saying it's, quote, a retreat from the consistent American position since the beginning of the war. He also said the abstention would, quote, harm the war effort as well as the effort to liberate the hostages, end quote. So we have a much bigger issue here, which is the lack of American support for the continuation of the war rather than the resolution, which is kind of meaningless. Now, a lot of people have called this move unprecedented, but it really isn't. This happens occasionally. When the U.S. gets sick of a certain Israeli policy that it's warned Israel about repeatedly, it will often show its displeasure by allowing a UN resolution to pass. There have been several cases of this happening. The two most recent ones were in 2009, uh, when the George W. Bush, in its final moments administration, did not veto a resolution calling for a ceasefire in that operation in Gaza. And in 2016, the Obama administration did something very similar with settlements, where it didn't veto a resolution about settlements. It also did allowed to pass a resolution recognizing a Palestinian state in the UN. So this occasionally happens to show displeasure with Israel. But I think the Israeli decision not to send a delegation to Washington is actually a lot more significant than resolution. To me, this is a case of Israel um, biting off its nose to spite its own face. We're talking about an operation in Rafah that is absolutely crucial for Israeli strategic and military interests. And I still think that Israel needs to still go into Rafah. It's just that now it had an opportunity to reach some sort of agreement on what that would look like with the United States, getting some kind of American approval for this necessary operation. This was Israel's last chance to go in with the full backing of the US without facing such a diplomatic price that it might not make the operation worthwhile. To actually give up that opportunity unbidden of Israel's own volition is absolutely insane. And if anything, it's going to stiffen the American opposition to an operation in Rafah, raising the price and cost. And we know that there could be a cost to this. Vice President Harris gave an interview on ABC, and she was pressed by the interviewer on whether there would be consequences if Netanyahu went forward, trying to see if she would say, no, there wouldn't be any consequences or there might be sanctions. She said, we're going to take it one step at a time, but we've been very clear in terms of our perspective on whether or not that would happen. The interviewer pressed her further. Are you ruling out there would be consequences from the United States? To which Harris finally said, having been somewhat cornered, I am ruling out nothing, which is her way of saying the invasion of Rafah could end up leading to sanctions. That means the cost for this invasion may be steeply high, because it's not enough just to think about the sanctions that would occur if Israel goes into Rafah. It's also the long-term damage to Israel's standing in the world if Israel has its major patron turn on it in the middle of a military operation. And of course, I wish the Biden administration wasn't doing all this, but I find it maddening how many opportunities Netanyahu had to avoid this. First, by invading much earlier, then by presenting a plan for evacuation when the US said they would only be willing to support an operation with a good plan for evacuation. Then they were given a further chance of sending a delegation to DC, but Netanyahu did none of those things. He allowed Israel to be pushed into a corner where going into Rafah would have a major cost. And you have to wonder why he did that. It could be that he wants that major cost so that Israel is at odds with the United States. He has to stand up with the United States. He has to look like the hero standing up to Biden. Or it could just be that he was outmaneuvered by Hamas. Either way, this does not look good for Netanyahu, and it's terrible for Israel, and I don't know how Israel gets out of it. Right now, it has to go into Rafah, but going into Rafah would be too high a cost for Israel to pay. I still support an operation, but Jesus, why does it have to be under these circumstances? Meanwhile, Netanyahu's not getting any good news at home either. The Haredi draft law, which his coalition partners, his Haredi coalition partners have pushed him into, and which Gantz said he would only support, that's the defense minister, said he would only support if there was broad consensus around it, has begun to tear his coalition apart. The law that they presented, the first draft, was so bad that the legal advisor to the government said that she could not defend it in court. And that means that it's a non-starter because in order to get the compromise, to get the go-ahead, they need a delay from the Supreme Court. And in order to get a delay from the Supreme Court, they need their legal advisor to defend it in court. So now it's going to change to a form where she can at least defend it. Meanwhile, for reasons that are not completely related, Gideon Saar, former justice minister, um, now was a member of the coalition in a united party with Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, announced that he's leaving the coalition. That comes just 2 weeks after he broke up the blue and white coalition that he had with Benny Gantz. Why did he leave? He demanded from Netanyahu that he get a seat in the wartime cabinet, which Netanyahu actually was not particularly against, but he knew that if he does that, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich would demand their seats, and he's actually concerned about what would happen if they were in the wartime cabinet. So he told Saar ultimately no, and Saar quit. Saar said, quote, "I believe and still believe that our goals are ambitious but achievable. Our soldiers have fought and are fighting bravely. But under Netanyahu, military progress has slowed down, prolonging the campaign. I cannot bear the responsibility as long as I have no practical possibility to influence the direction of policy. I just don't see any use in it anymore. We did not come to the government to warm chairs. We came to the government, which we initially opposed, to help the people of Israel." He also accused Netanyahu of slowing down the war and not being able to win it. And that's why he wanted more influence within the cabinet. Now, Saar only has 4 mandates. And he's very likely to not get back into the Knesset again in the future. So it's not all that important numerically, but it does remove the taboo of leaving the united government. First, when Gantz joined the government, it was a very popular move. I certainly supported it, and so did just about everyone else in Israel, because a unity government was needed to win the war. Now, there's a sense, a much stronger sense among many people in Israel that Netanyahu is not running the war well, whether because they think he's going too far to the right or to the left. A lot of people are dissatisfied. And Saar leaving removes some of that taboo of leaving the government. Now, Gantz, who there is tremendous pressure on to leave, will find it easier to leave than he did before. And he is indeed signaling that he's going to leave. And what Gantz is saying he's going to leave over is the draft bill. That makes sense because it's very unpopular. His voters would never forgive him if he cooperated with it. It's a good winner for him to break up the coalition over. So Gantz said today that he wants to see a law that will be an agreement on enlistment and not an agreement on exemption. He said, quote, "I cannot be part of a government that passes such a law at all, and especially not during wartime." And he said that if the law hits the books, the law is set to hit the books in June. There's pressure on him to not stay even as the law is progressing, so to leave even earlier than that. Saar being out puts pressure on him to leave. Gadi Eisenkot, his number 2, who is very popular, thinks that they should quit right now. So Gantz is starting to move towards thinking that he might leave earlier even than June. So Netanyahu's in a lot of trouble. He seems to have lost his ability to win this war with American support. And, Ben Gurion said that in order for Israel to win a war, it needs to have the support of at least one great power. That great power has always been the US. And traditionally, when the US has abandoned support of Israel, Israel has stopped. And there's a reason for that. The terrifying threat of Israel remaining with no backing, with sanctions on it, is something that Israel has always tried to avoid. Meanwhile, his coalition is disintegrating because of the incredibly unpopular law trying to continue the exemption of Haredi men, while Israeli secular national religious soldiers are crumbling under the incredible pressure of the war and their increased time serving. Both of these own goals have weakened the Israeli position, have weakened Netanyahu significantly. I always believed Israel had a good chance of winning this war. I'm not sure I see how anymore. The diplomatic clock has expired. I said here endlessly that Israel should go into Rafah because I was concerned that the clock would expire and it wouldn't be able to go in. And now that the clock has expired, we look at the achievements of the Netanyahu government in this war, and we don't really see any. There's no Rafah, no Sinwar, no hostages. The people in the north have still not returned to their homes. Hamas has not been defeated. And Israel's relationship with the United States has not been worse in a very long time, and it seems increasingly isolated on the world stage. And just as I was about to record this, I saw that Hamas had said no to the latest offer in the ceasefire talks, and it's easy to see why. They feel like they're winning. Even though Israel is winning militarily, diplomatically and politically, Hamas have done everything right, and Israel has done everything wrong. All right, now I got a lot of comments to my last video, most of them very supportive and nice, so thank you for that. But I only got two questions. So let me answer those two questions. Harry Newhoff, friend of the show, asked, "Can you please talk about the North, especially when the citizens will be able to move back there?" So I mentioned that Netanyahu has had several issues that he's been unable to resolve. And the return of people to their homes in the north is one of those issues. And we don't talk about it a lot on Twitter or in the United States or in the news abroad, but in Israel, it's a big deal. There's a sense that those people have been abandoned and have been protected by the government. Just recently, the military and the government decided to extend the stay of residents in the north in hotels in various places until July. And since that shows a lot of weakness on the side, part of the government, there's a lot of people who regret ever evacuating them. Foreign Minister Katz said that they should never have made the evacuation to begin with, that it was a big mistake. Right now, there's no pathway to them going home unless there's a ceasefire with Hamas, because Hezbollah said that they'll continue the fight in the north as long as the fight in Gaza continues as well. Finally, Sunny LaBouffe says, "Do you see any universe in which a sensible day after plan is presented? I honestly struggle to imagine Netanyahu risking his coalition by doing so under almost any circumstance. I also do not cling to hope that he will leave office anytime soon, at least not before the scheduled election date, by which point it will be far too late." Yeah, so the only way I agree with you, it's hard to see Netanyahu doing the day after plan. It's hard to see Netanyahu doing anything productive at all. Whatever expectations I had from Netanyahu at the beginning of this war, he's been so much worse than I thought. Um, so I don't see it with him. The only chance for a decent day after plan is if this government collapses and someone else takes over. Whether it's a new Likud government under Gallant or a government under Gantz or Eisenkot, any of those three, you would see some kind of day after plan. I've seen some of their ideas, all three of their ideas, and I like some of their ideas. So we would need one of those three to take over. Certainly possible, especially with this whole draft plan. But as we know, Netanyahu is a real survivor, and you never bet on him losing power. So we just have to hope that he is replaced by someone who can get a day after plan. Okay, so that's it for this episode. Consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. Follow my podcast, History of the Land of Israel podcast, and I will continue doing these as more exciting developments occur.